Our topic tonight is the United States, morality in world politics, and our guest will use as a case study South Africa and current policy there. Our guest is Alan Lee Keyes, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. If I may say, our guest is an Army brat, and at age 16 was then the youngest winner of the National American Legion Oratorical Contest. Not even our sound system will be sufficient to get in his way. And of course, that's an honor which Senator Frank Church held as a young man. He's a graduate of Harvard College, and he holds a PhD also from Harvard University in government. He joined the United States Foreign Service in 1978. He's been a consultant with the National Security Council. He's been a member of the policy planning staff at State. He served as a desk officer in the Office of South African Affairs, and he's been stationed in Bombay. In 1980, where he met his wife, I understand. In 1983, he was appointed as the U.S. representative to the United Nations Economic and Security Council, serving there with the rank of ambassador. He represented the United States there and at numerous conferences around the world, including serving as the deputy director of the U.S. delegation to the World Population Conference in Mexico City, and as a member of the U.S. delegation to the Women's Conference in Nairobi. In November of 1985, he was appointed to his current position as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. I'm looking forward, and I know you are, to this evening's address. Harvard has a nice reputation in their government department as taking questions of ethics and morality seriously. Professor Mansfield and others enjoy a good reputation. I'm not sure at all that the ambassador attributes any of his remarks to his Harvard education. I think the late President Kennedy was once told that he was I think the poet Frost told him that, I understand you're both Irish and from Harvard. And never forget you're Irish. The topic tonight is a very serious one, and the ambassador's remarks, I know, will be thoughtful and important. It gives me enormous pleasure to present to you Ambassador Alan Keyes.
Thank you very much. I suppose I shouldn't begin by saying that whatever it is I say this evening is in spite of having gone to Harvard, because that wouldn't entirely be true. In fact, I owe a lot to the man you mentioned, Harvey Mansfield, who was my advisor there. Great man. I said I owe a lot to the man he mentioned, Harvey Mansfield, Jr., who was a great man. Not working. Well then, we won't deal with it.
I think we're going to depend on our speaker.
What I would like to do this evening is to talk in general for a while about the problem of dealing with issues of moral values, particularly those having to do with human rights in the foreign policy arena. A topic that I think is a special problem for the United States, given the character of our domestic regime, probably a more special problem for us than it has been for any other nation in the history of the world, and certainly more of a problem than it has been for any power that has played the kind of role that we have come to play in the world. After I've talked in general about it, I want to focus for a while on a problem that I've worked with for some time in the government, on which I've had occasion to speak out before, and which I think, given recent events, warrants another look. And that is the problem of South Africa, which is a case in point, and one that has gotten a lot of attention in recent times with respect to this whole question of dealing with moral issues in foreign affairs. Given the fact that the United States is a country that in a very real sense derives its identity from shared values, it's really very difficult to define our national interest entirely apart from our values. We cannot secure our nation by means that simply undermine or contradict these shared values, because that kind of external security would be purchased at the price of undermining the common sense of principle and process that makes it possible for us to work, cooperate, and most importantly, compromise in our domestic affairs. These shared values make our liberal democratic system possible. They include the belief in the dignity of the individual and the requirement that to be legitimate, government must respect his rights. They include the notion that all legitimate political authority derives from the consent of the people, but that even such consent cannot legitimate abuses of power that violate the basic principle of respect for individual rights. They include the belief that this basic principle is good for all human beings as a natural consequence of their humanity. These shared values are principles that should guide our conduct wherever we deal with human beings. For us, there can be no distinction in principle between the way we treat people at home and the way we treat people abroad, since by virtue of their humanity, all are entitled to the same basic respect. The distinction between foreign and domestic arenas is for us a factual and historic distinction, not a distinction in principle. It is blurred even in fact by the universality of our population and the ties that we maintain to people in every part of the world. When Poles, blacks, Jews, or Asians suffer abroad, we feel with them. We feel with them because we are blacks, we are Asians, we are Poles, we are Christians and Muslims and Jews. We feel with them because we are Americans, in touch with all humanity. To say that policy should be guided by basic values doesn't tell us how to apply that guidance successfully. In a dangerous world, the principles of right conduct run every day into the harsh requirements of survival. There are no unambiguous choices. Like politicians and statesmen before us, we are fated to seek the good, but to do the necessary, sometimes whether or not it is perfectly good. Now, I think we Americans are fortunate. The founders of our nation were keenly aware of the necessary limits of moral statesmanship. They realized that the quest for justice in human things must necessarily be limited by respect for human nature, the rights which derive from it, but also the vices and passions which inhere in it. Madison observed that if men were angels, government would not be necessary. This implies that even at its best, government reflects upon the imperfection of the human condition. Now, all of that is rather abstract when you articulate it in that way, but I think it has a very practical bearing on the debate concerning morality, human rights, and the conduct of foreign affairs. Those who would entirely exclude considerations of morality and human rights from foreign policy forget that we are a nation whose identity depends upon shared principles of political right. those who harshly criticize and condemn our policies when they fall short of what they believe to be perfect adherence to those principles, forget that in the imperfect realm of human nature, choice may be less a matter of moral decision than of simple necessity. Take, for example, the problem of our dealings with undemocratic or tyrannical regimes in different parts of the world. Some argue that we should forget morality and support as friends any who are willing to make common cause with us against our enemies. Others argue that we should cut ties or distance ourselves from undemocratic or authoritarian regimes, regardless of our security or other material interests. It seems pretty clear to me that we can do neither. In a world where most regimes are undemocratic, our only choice is which undemocratic regimes we work with, not whether we work with any. On the other hand, as we deal with this necessity, we should not encourage the view that undemocratic or tyrannical regimes are simply acceptable to us. If we must work with some of them, we must also work insofar as possible to improve their character, which is to say, to encourage democratic reform. Now that is a tall order, because though political freedom is a natural right, it is not, and has not been, a normal condition. Throughout most of human history, free government has been the exception, not the rule. This means that given the facts in any situation, that is to say the culture, history, and circumstances of a given country, those facts may or may not be favorable to freedom. That is, to respect for human rights and to the possibility of self-government. Now that poses a problem, because I think that our pursuit of human rights goals has to be limited by the principle that is the basis of human right in general, which is to say consent as the basis of government and respect for the choice of the individual. Contrary to Rousseau's famous dictum, I think in The Social Contract, it is not logically consistent to force people to be free. In the end, self-government must be chosen. It cannot be imposed. And that, of course, means that if cultural predilections and inclinations in history and various other kinds of choices with respect to religious and ideological beliefs create problems for freedom, we can try to encourage those who wish to work with and overcome those problems. But we simply can't force the phenomenon of free government to come into existence. At the same time, our understanding of the situation in any given country, as well as our ability to influence it constructively, will be limited, always. We are neither all wise nor all powerful. Thus, even where individuals are disposed to assert their rights, our ability to help them is limited. Our limited ability means that we cannot always do as much as we would like. Our limited wisdom means that even what we do may have consequences contrary to our intention. Also, since we have inescapable material and physical security interests, we cannot and should not pretend that our concern with rights is absolute, that it transcends every other consideration. After all, come into government and you take responsibility not for your own moral choice only, but for the kinds of decisions that can affect the fate of millions of people alive and even more millions of people in generations yet unborn. It is not possible for a statesman in that position to make simply absolute moral choices, regardless of what effect they will have upon the interests of all of those people and upon that future. It's not possible. And that means that though we can seek the good insofar as possible, we must still take account of those inescapable interests. That is not only a choice we have to make. I think for those in responsible positions in government, It is a moral obligation. It's a moral obligation which means that we, above all, cannot simply be prey to our own moral zeal. Now, given this kind of a limiting factor, it's clear that support of democratic reform in the world should not take on the character, at least as far as the participation of government is concerned, it should not take on the character of an absolute moral crusade. It has to be limited by and based on a clear understanding of our interests. And in the use of our limited resources, it is quite natural and necessary that our pursuit of those moral and goals of principle should be limited by and consistent with our efforts to protect our basic vital interests in the world. Now, I often get questions about, well, why is it that we don't take this and that problem seriously? We're always talking about human rights abuses in the communist world, and that we work with this or that dictator. And it seems to me that the answer to that is quite simple. There are some things you do in the world because you have to, and because if you don't do them, you won't be around to do good in years to come. And if someone wants to argue that it's going to be better for democracy and moral values, that the United States and the principles it represents should be defeated by the adversaries of freedom, I have to say I find that a very strange kind of moral reasoning. But given all of the limiting factors I described, it's clear that our pursuit of democratic reform will always pose a very difficult problem for us. I don't believe that the limits should discourage us from pursuing such reforms. And in any case, I think our principles would leave us with very little choice in that matter. But an awareness of the limits does suggest that our pursuit of democratic reform, wherever it may be, has to be a careful and prudent one. Now, it's obvious that careful prudence is a very difficult attitude to maintain when dealing with this subject, because it's an area that very often is going to be influenced by the strongest of moral passions. Now, it's clear, righteous passion, indignation, can sometimes be a force for good, but it can also be a heady intoxicant, dulling or eliminating the keen rational judgment that is needed to translate absolutely good intentions into relatively good results. Righteous passion also breeds intolerance, the hidden progenitor of tyranny. Freedom means that persuasion is essential to government. And persuasion requires that we accept human beings as they are, with all their vices, and seek to improve their character and condition by means that respect their choice, even when that choice is slow or ignorant or wrong. Without some tolerance for this imperfection, the passion for justice and right becomes itself the most fertile source of tyranny. It can also become a potent cause of intractable and enormously destructive war. I think that the lack of caution, prudence, and tolerance for the imperfections of human nature is what has given the so-called revolutions of the 20th century their sanguinary character. It has also meant that instead of liberating, the revolutionary fervor of our day tends to deepen and intensify oppression. For the sake of justice, every kind of injustice is perpetrated. For the sake of liberation, every kind of freedom is denied. It seems as if the passionate, or at least passionately declared, commitment to right is all that is needed to justify any wrong, however monstrous, however palpable, however prolonged. I've often thought about that because, after all, what else can explain the tolerance among so many supposedly fervent advocates of justice for the enormous crimes committed by the Leninist regimes of the East Bloc and in the developing world? I mean, I know, we'll hear a lot about South Africa. I'll talk about that a little later. We hear a lot about a few of the Latin Americans who violate human rights in Chile and so forth. But you know, when you examine them case by case, even those cases pale by comparison with what you would learn if you looked at the case of a Uganda or an Ethiopia or a Cambodia or a Romania. But who talks about those things? Those are, quote-unquote, progressive regimes in the parlance of the United Nations. And you will not find them on the agenda of the Human Rights Commission, unless, of course, we put them there. And yet, at the same time, you look at the reality of those regimes, and every kind of human right and freedom is denied, not just incidentally, not just as a result of some kind of class animosity, no, but structurally, systematically, totally denied, as part and parcel of the ideology and practice that supports the regime. And yet somehow, they escape all the moral fervor that is directed against the few that we hear so much about. Now, it seems to me that if we're going to avoid this kind of excess and imbalance and contradiction, the pursuit of democratic reform demands prudence. It means that moral passion must be disciplined by rational judgment, by an awareness of necessary human imperfection, and by an unyielding objectivity in the assessment of possibilities and consequences. Rather than bespeaking less moral commitment, such discipline demands more than is ordinary. Now, I think that the best way to try to illustrate what I've been talking about is to discuss a case in point. And in fact, as you probably guessed, the outline of those principles was just to prepare you for the discussion of this case in point. For the debate on the South African issue in this country has been characterized by outraged passion, by indignation, by anger, by guilt. It has been characterized by everything except disciplined, rational judgment and an unyielding objectivity in the assessment of possibilities and consequences. It has, for the most part, been a debased and irresponsible discussion. And it has, for the most part, resulted in irresponsible choices that are having and will have tragic consequences. The debate on Southern Africa has been characterized by a lot of passionate statements. And the emotional wave of opposition to apartheid reached its first crest last fall with passage of a bill establishing limited economic sanctions against South Africa. The passage of this bill signaled a series of disinvestment decisions by major U.S. investors in South Africa. The passage of this bill temporarily slaked the moral passions aroused in the United States by the issue of U.S. relations with South Africa. And the front has been relatively quiet. And maybe that's what some intended. But I presume that the purpose of the bill was not simply to try to diffuse this passion, to deal in an expedient way with a temporary domestic political problem. The supporters of the sanctions bill argued that it was the best use of U.S. leverage against apartheid. By bringing this form of pressure to bear against South Africa, we would make clear America's unequivocal opposition to apartheid. We would strengthen anti-apartheid forces in South Africa. We would grasp the last chance to do away with apartheid without cataclysmic violence. The sanctions bill was presented as somehow serving the cause of peaceful, democratic reform in South Africa. Yet in the months since its passage, every negative consequence predicted by the opponents of the sanctions approach has come to pass. Black workers have been adversely affected by the stampede of disinvestment touched off by and intensified by the sanctions legislation. An example. When General Motors sold its South African subsidiary to local interests, 1,800 black workers went on strike. GM called in police to evict the demonstrators, fired 785 workers, and finally ended the strike after 3 weeks by threatening immediate dismissal. Fact, when Ford's local subsidiary merged with a locally owned car company to reduce their shareholdings to minority status, it promised no large-scale retrenchment. But the new company closed Ford's old auto plants in the Port Elizabeth area, leaving more than 3,000 workers to add to the city's extraordinarily high unemployment rate. According to the New York Times, quote, by some estimates, the Americans' withdrawal has cost 100,000 jobs in local companies that used to work for them, unquote. Now, the great majority of departing U.S. companies have continued selling products to South Africa while abandoning so-called Sullivan Code pledges, pledges to press for black advancement and change in white attitudes. With a few exceptions, like IBM, which has sold share-convertible points to all its employees, divestors have sold out to white South African managers who are under far less pressure to liberalize hiring, training, promotion, or political affairs strategies. Obviously, the consequence of that kind of move has been the concentration of ownership of assets in the South African economy, the further concentration of that ownership in the hands of the indigenous white establishment. Barclays National Bank, one of the largest foreign investors and the largest commercial bank in South Africa, has announced its decision to pull out, selling its remaining assets to its South African partners. The sale allows South African investors to regain control of the country's biggest bank for the first time in 61 years. One South African merchant bank is using the list of Sullivan signatories as a marketing tool to locate potential buyouts. Some white investors have made millions buying the assets of the 75 firms that have pulled out in the last 2 years. Projects in education, training, and community improvement funded by major foreign investors have been damaged or eliminated. Black-white polarization, as well as tension and violence within the black community, has increased. In backlash against international pressure, government repression has increased. Pro-reform forces within the government have been marginalized or have gotten out. Remaining hardliners, no longer even minimally sensitive to external opinion, have had a free hand. As an example, in the second week of April, Pretoria announced a decree that bars virtually any public call for the release of people detained without charge under a 10-month-old state of emergency. The government has clamped down on the press and other forms of free expression. Implementation of measures for racial discrimination in schooling and housing, which had been eroding in some areas, are now being more strictly enforced. Forced removal of blacks from their homes in urban areas, which the government pledged to halt 2 years ago, have once again become an issue. Such movement as there was toward change in the white community seems effectively to have ceased. The recent elections show a strong trend toward the hardline, pro-apartheid, right-wing parties among the white electorate. Hesitant openness to change appears to have given way to fear and stubborn racism. The elections have given rise to bitter reactions in the black community in South Africa, as well as sagely despairing prognostications in the American media. The voices of ignorant passion and false expectations are becoming the prophets of furious indignation and equally false despair. Just as many of the opponents of sanctions predicted, the sanctions approach has not been the last alternative to violence, but rather an encouraging prelude to deeper polarization and eventual civil war. We can surely expect that in the face of the predictable failure of the sanctions currently in place, voices will soon be raised to encourage a new round of even tougher sanctions measures. Before they are once again carried away by thoughtless, emotional appeals, the American people and their representatives in Congress would do well to consider the consequences of what they have already done and the enormous costs of persisting in this course of self-righteous folly. America is well down the dead-end road of irrelevance to any process of relatively peaceful democratic reform in South Africa. The only way to sustain the sanctions approach, as many of its supporters now admit, would be through a program of multi-billion-dollar assistance to South Africa's neighboring states, a program far beyond our capacity in ordinary times, and certainly out of reach during this period of severe fiscal constraint. Given the conflicts going on in the region, any program of massive assistance to the neighboring states would imply some kind of security commitment as well. Thus, the sanctions approach, far from being part of a strategy for encouraging relatively peaceful change, would in effect become a policy of U.S. support for one side in a debilitating regional war. The label promises a remedy, but the pills contain poison. Poison for the economic power and organizational strength of blacks in South Africa. Poison for the proponents of democratic change in South Africa. Poison for the effectiveness of U.S. policy toward South Africa. Disinvestment threatens the major tools of black activism against the structures and effects of apartheid, unions, and consumer boycotts. As Les Waldorf wrote recently in the New Republic magazine, and I quote, "Although disinvestment affects relatively few workers, among these workers are the most unionized in the country. The plant closure following Ford's merger left 1/3 of Makusa and 1/3 of Nawu, two major unions, members jobless, thereby weakening two of the most militant trade unions in the Eastern Cape. Disinvestment also threatens another tool of nonviolent resistance to apartheid, that of boycotts. Last year, boycotts evolved into a nationwide strategy for pressuring white businessmen to oppose apartheid. But such actions are only sustainable where the community has disposable income, which disinvestment is likely to reduce. By weakening the tools of nonviolent resistance, disinvestment encourages the cycle of repression and violence in South Africa. In a speech before a symposium on liberalism sponsored by the South African Institute of Race Relations, Ken Owen, one of South Africa's leading journalists and editor of the influential journal Business Day, painted a grim picture of the future to which this cycle must lead. And I quote, "A threatened sovereignty protects itself," he observed. "Even limited sovereignty does so. Where protection of the security forces fails, as in Kraaifontein, armed white civilians start shooting. A new pattern is emerging in bits and pieces," he continued. "An irresistible force, the radicalization of the black population, is running into an immovable object in the shape of the white security forces. Both white and black communities are retreating into fortresses, and conflict occurs on the margin." Owen portrays a South Africa of armed gangs, areas controlled by more or less by armed militias, brutal repression by security forces. And it portrays a situation less dominated by organized government than by organized violence and chaos. It is the portrait of a South African Lebanon, in which the forces that might shape the country's more positive destiny are ground to nothing between unyielding extremes of violence. If this is the future that we Americans want to help bring about in South Africa, then the sanctions approach appears to be the way to achieve that goal. But if our goal is a more positive one, aimed at helping to build a democratic, healthy society in which all people participate equally, regardless of race, and from which all can benefit, then we must think again. And that requires, of course, that we give some serious thought to what could be the positive alternative for us in our policies and for the world. I think the first thing we might try to do is to stop the destruction of the basis of positive U.S. leverage in South Africa, to halt and reverse the process of disinvestment. Before the Congress considers any further steps in the wrong direction, a careful, objective assessment of the impact of sanctions should be commissioned. It might help to know the consequences of what we are doing. It might help to look at them carefully, rather than merely to give in to our own self-righteous fury, to our own desire to appear to be on the right side, while in effect encouraging the wrong conclusion. Investors remaining in South Africa should consider carefully the impact any decision to disinvest will have on the economic and organizational power of black South Africans and on the environment for change in the country. Oh, I know. The decisions for disinvestment have looked at the bottom line, and the decisions for disinvestment have looked at the political consequences. But I wonder if there is anyone among all these self-righteous voices who is actually seriously considering the consequences for the people of South Africa, the people who will lose their jobs and their livelihood, the people who will suffer and die in the war that is to come. I think that we would do better to devise programs that are aimed at maximizing the positive impact of the U.S. and other international presence in South Africa. As noted in the January 27th report by a special commission to the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, quote, a statement which says that because black South Africans are denied their political rights, efforts to improve their economic, educational, and social status are cosmetic or trivial is a fallacy, unquote. Such efforts, encouraged by the so-called Sullivan Principles, were not proceeding as strongly as they should have. Disinvestment threatens to curtail them further. A decided, conscious effort must be made to reverse this damage. Improvements in wages, training, education, and the incorporation of blacks into significant managerial positions must be encouraged and increased. Such activism will not be possible in the context of a simply hostile relationship with the South African government. Already, the government is threatening steps that will isolate groups working for change from external support. The hostility encouraged by the sanctions approach has sharpened these threats. Therefore, a realistic relationship with the South African government is a prerequisite for effective policy. We cannot work exclusively through the South African government, nor do we have to. But we cannot maintain positive influence through a simply hostile relationship. The government, even during the last campaign, claims that it is still committed to reform. We should devise effective means to test these claims. We say that we wish to establish a dialogue among the various elements of South African society. The recent white election demonstrates that the present South African government, whether we like it or not, enjoys the support of the majority of the white community. Without effective relationships with this government, efforts to promote dialogue will clearly have little practical result. Apartheid is the enemy. Insofar as the government enforces the apartheid system, insofar as it abuses government power in support of it, we must oppose its actions. But insofar as such opposition becomes total opposition to any relationship with the government, putting the United States in a purely adversarial position, we become irrelevant to prospects for democratic change in South Africa. Realism about our relationship with the South African government should be accompanied by strenuous efforts to develop effective, sustaining ties with a broad range of elements in the black community. We have for far too long been prey to the myth that these are mutually exclusive approaches. Proponents of sanctions encourage us to concentrate on a minority of black leadership, virtually ignoring the diversity of the black community. We should resist this tendency. As noted again in the report to the Bishops' Conference, quote, it seems logical that black people desperately want an end to the oppression of apartheid and are willing to endure some hardship to see this happen. It seems, however, that if the policy is likely to produce a loss of their vitally needed jobs, most blacks prove to be tentative about pressing the issue. The Commission concludes from this report that it cannot be said that blacks favor sanctions and are prepared to endure the hardship, a view apparently held by a minority only. For when the stark reality of loss of jobs is presented, then quite humanly, this specter forces the preference for sanctions into the background." Unquote. A recent survey of the 11 major opinion polls taken among blacks in the last 3 years suggests 3 conclusions. 1, blacks are adamantly opposed to apartheid and welcome pressure on the South African government to change it. 2, blacks oppose measures that increase their already large economic burdens. And 3, blacks oppose measures that would decrease jobs in the modern sector. Quote, "The full range of surveys leads one to the conclusion that at this stage only a minority of about 1/4 or less of rank-and-file blacks in major metropolitan areas, less if rural blacks are included, would support total disinvestment or full economic boycotts," unquote. It seems to me that we should be devising policies to reach out to and work with the blacks in South Africa holding these views. It's obvious that black South Africans are determined to defeat apartheid, but they are well aware of the sources of their real strength in the struggle against it. Our policies should reflect, rather than ignore, this awareness. Such policies would include efforts to strengthen the organizational base in the black community. This means concentrating on labor unions as well as other civic associations and groups. It means seeking out and working with grassroots leaders of all persuasions, not just those popular with our media. Though we are told that South Africans, blacks, are desperately radicalized, a recent article in the Christian Science Monitor painted a somewhat different picture. Quote, "For poorer blacks who flock to the urban townships in search of work, to lash out against a powerful and determined state is a luxury that takes a distant second place to the struggle to work, to eat, earn, and provide. Those blacks with jobs have jobs to protect. Because of the most successful of the government's race policy reforms, the legalization of black labor union membership. These workers also have reason to expect that working within the system is the surest way to increase their earnings. And urban blacks who are middle class or about to be have a greater stake to defend." It seems to me that we should be working with people who are seeking their freedom on the basis of preserving rather than destroying their livelihood. I think we should also try, through programs of expanded capital ownership, to seek to increase the resource base of the black community. Instead of spending financial resources to disinvest, companies should be encouraged to devise schemes for financing stock purchases by black employees, for including worker representatives in corporate governing structures. We are willing to talk about the fantasy of spending billions of dollars in various and assorted programs that will probably not materialize. But there are concrete ways in which we could use our resources, building on the kind of power blacks in South Africa already have today as a result of the modern economy, to increase and organize and strengthen that positive, nonviolent power. And I think we have to remember that such measures are not remedial, as some people say, because economic power is the basis of organizational strength, and organizational strength is the key to relatively peaceful, democratic revolution. Now, going through all of that, and as I wrote all of this, and thought about the events of recent weeks, the election, strikes, it's inevitable that the question has to occur to one. You know, it's all well and good, but we took the wrong step and it had the wrong consequences. And maybe it's just too late. The proponents of the sanction approach would argue, I suppose, that the cycle of repression has gone beyond the point where a positive approach can be effective. They argue that only the pressure of further sanctions can have an effect. But the effect of sanctions has been counterproductive. By destroying the nonviolent means of struggle against apartheid and encouraging violence, the hopeless view becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I would have to say that I think the media in this country contributes to the impression of despair. They focus mainly on the most bitter pro-sanctions leaders in South Africa, virtually ignoring more moderate, indeed any other elements. They refuse to report or give attention to Americans, myself included, who speak out against sanctions and offer a more positive alternative. They have granted a virtual monopoly of public attention to the voices of blind passion, the proponents of negative, destructive approaches, the architects of confusion and false despair. Now I know, we have all heard the arguments of the Jesse Jacksons and the Randall Robinsons. I think, as you can tell, that I think that they are wrong. And I would challenge any one of them to a public debate on this issue, to debate the merits of this question based upon the facts, and let the American people be the judge. The situation in South Africa has become more deeply troubled, more dangerously polarized in recent months, partly as a result of the sanctions approach. To discourage further deterioration, we should re-examine our own actions and policies. We should reverse those steps that have helped to make our actions and policies part of the tragedy. The greatest loss of our mistaken approach has been that bad policy drives out good. Because of the adoption of sanctions, we were in no position to influence the South African government's response to the Indaba constitutional proposals. This blueprint for a multiracial provincial government in Natal, worked out through negotiations among various racial groups, offered at least one clear path of hope for South Africa's future. Yet because of sanctions, at the moment it was laid on the table, our influence was non-existent. The situation will be truly hopeless if we persist in a negative approach that eliminates our country as a force for positive, relatively peaceful change. The debate on our South African policy should not be a debate over sanctions or a self-centered preoccupation with the ghosts and vestiges of our own historic struggle against racism. If we are to play a positive role, then we must devise a positive agenda, one that uses rather than undermines our influence for good. I realize that the issue of South Africa has receded for a time from the agenda of politicians and bureaucrats concerned only with limiting the damage it might cause to themselves. But for those Americans who truly care about the future of South Africa and its people, who suffer in their hearts the injustices of oppression, the blight of violence, the tragedy of destroyed hope and potential. The importance of the South African issue does not depend upon the passions of the moment. We should seek, and some of us, I think, will continue to seek, to work carefully and persistently to identify all the positive forces of change, to work with all the positive forces of change, and to promote a U.S. policy that can be, over time, a sustained and hopefully successful force for democratic change. Thank you.
Well, for a intellectually satisfying and stirring presentation, a marvelous challenge, we thank you very much. The ambassador has agreed to answer questions until 10 minutes after 7. We'll follow our normal procedure. I'll recognize you and repeat the questions for the benefit of our cameras, and then the ambassador will respond.
Secretary Keyes, I'm not sure that I agree or disagree with your conclusions. So you see, I don't come to you with a bias. But I have to confess I'm worried about your logic. So if I may do what you did in establishing your point and cite generally some things and then end specifically with a question, I would enjoy doing that. You said in the beginning of your address that it's not logically consistent to force people to freedom. And certainly with that I agree. But you went on to say that we have to do what we have to do, or we won't be around to do good in years to come. But if we do bad in order to be around to do good in years to come, I just question that logic, and that's a general statement. You then went on to suggest to us that General Motors and Ford's were not successful because their actions reduced jobs. But you did add that they continued to sell or have financial dealings. So perhaps the real reason for their pullout was somewhat manipulative and not morally pure. And perhaps that too is what obfuscated and damaged their disinvestment. And then you went on to say that we must stop destruction of the basic U.S. leverage in South Africa. And of course, that's the argument that the present administration has used for our dealings with Iran. Now, I'm not very content with this logic because when we look for leverage, good or bad leverage, to do a good thing, we might end up with the wrong side, the wrong lever. And I'd like to ask you to answer the question of how we can assure ourselves that being Machiavellian, doing what we need to do, albeit bad on occasion, is going to do good in the end. And in South Africa, particularly, specifically, you mentioned as your answer, and I'd be glad to know that it would work, but you mentioned that we could actually, this is the question, we could actually invest money for them to invest in stocks. Do you think that's realistic? Is that your answer to my question?
Well, just a number of points. First of all, I did not say, oh, you want to repeat the question if you can?
We'll edit that out of the... would you comment upon the dilemma of doing, as was suggested, bad in order to achieve a longer-term good? I think that was a recurrent theme followed up that, but there were a number of questions. And
of course, it's always very interesting that you get into a discussion like this, and I've noticed this every time I've had a discussion about South Africa. One simply can't get people to talk about South Africa. They must talk about something else. So you talk about South Africa, they'll mention Nicaragua, they'll mention Iran, because they have no case to make with regard to South Africa. But with regard to my own statement, I did not say that we should do bad things. I never said that. What I said was that we might have to do things that are not perfectly good. And that means that in reaching for the absolute good, and that's what we've done in this case, we want to be morally pure. We want to appear to be the perfect angels here. And in reaching for the best, we are pushing the situation toward the worst. That's what I said. And there's a great difference between asking that we not insist upon perfection in our actions, which is impossible in the political arena in any case, and saying that we should do bad things. As a matter of fact, I quite explicitly said that there is no way for us to escape the standards of our own values in the international arena. That does not mean that we have to apply those values foolishly, that we have to apply them without discrimination as to our own interests and as to the possibility, and most importantly of all, as to the consequences of what we do. And that is what I wanted to focus on, the consequences. Because I say, well, maybe the reason that the disinvestment decision of GM didn't work is because they didn't take it out of morally pure motives. I am not looking at their motives. I am looking at the consequences of what they have done. And I'm asking myself, did those consequences help or hurt the black people of South Africa? Did they encourage or discourage the cycle of violence? Did they increase or decrease the organizational strength and power of blacks to move for nonviolent change? And the answer I give to those objective questions is that they did all of those bad things. Now you tell me, it seems to me that you're absolutely right. When we go about trying to use our leverage, we should be very careful to think through the consequences. But then if I heard your question right, you were saying, well, maybe we shouldn't try to use our leverage. Then what are we supposed to do? Because it seems to me that if you're going to try to do something good, you have to do it with something. The word leverage simply means that you use the tools that are available. You use them in the best way that you can, in a hope of achieving the most positive consequences that you can. And that's all that you can hope for. And that's all that we can ask of ourselves. But it is what we should ask of ourselves. And we have not asked it of ourselves in this case. We have been content to adopt a posture of moral purity and to adopt actions that will have incalculably tragic moral consequences.
About the self-righteous Americans. In my confusion about looking at sanctioned or not sanctioned, some of the issues that you brought up were brought to my attention. And so during my confusion, I looked to Bishop Tutu. Didn't he recommend sanctions, and can you comment?
Yes, it seems to me, you know, in my own thinking about South Africa. Oh, repeat the question, Bishop. Sorry.
Would you comment upon Bishop Tutu's position on sanctions?
Now, in my own thinking about South Africa, the problem is that there are a number of people. I think I even have a little list of names here somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. Let me see if you have ever heard of these folks. Bishop Isaac Mokanena. Have you ever heard of him? Have you ever heard that name? Isaac Mokanena. Have you ever heard of him? Bishop Barnabas Leganyane. Have you ever heard of him? Bishop Leganyane is the head of the Zion Christian Church. Its membership is 6 million black South Africans. Have you ever heard his name? Bishop Isaac Mokanena is the president of Reformed Independent Church of the Association of South Africa. It has a membership of 4.5 million blacks. Have you ever heard his name? So you ask me what Bishop Tutu thinks, as if to say, well, that is a man who speaks for all South Africa. And I say, you don't know who speaks for South Africa. Your media hasn't told you. They haven't revealed to you the diversity of opinion that exists in that country. From people like this, millions of black people represented. You know, they had misgivings, doubts, and objections to the sanctions approach. Were they ever reported? Did anyone ever know? No. The chosen apostles of the media in this country were the only ones that you heard from. And the facts that were represented by others were never brought to your attention. So when you ask me that question, I say that I am looking at the whole range of those opinions. I'm looking at the opinion polls. I'm looking at the range of people who have views on this issue. And I am asking myself, you know, I would work with anybody who wants to bring the apartheid system to an end and who wants to achieve a truly democratic future for South Africa. But I'll work with those people as well who want to build that future, who are building it every day with their hands and their hearts, and who have great doubts and hesitations about an approach that will take the tools from their hands and the roof from over their head and the jobs and bread from their mouths and tell them that this strengthens them for the struggle.
Yes, sir.
I read a few weeks ago that a delegation of some leaders from South Africa, some black leaders in particular, civic leaders and religious leaders, did come to the United States during the debate on sanctions, recognizing that I believe Bishop Tutu represents only 2% of the black, only 2% of the Episcopalians in Africa are black, and that other voices wanted to be heard, and that they sent a delegation to the United States at their own expense, and that none of the major press elements interviewed them. The